I am Bruce Grant from the Department of Anthropology here at NYU. We just have a really nice, easy session today with one of my favorite colleagues and a really excellent scholar, Alena Ledeneva, who's come to us across the Atlantic in connection, I think, with the Slavic Association meetings, which will be in Boston later this week. Many of us don't get to see her as often as we would like, so it's really a nice pleasure. I'd like to tell you just a bit about her before we start our session today. I knew some of this informally, but wanted to verify again today. She is a professor of politics and society at University College London, especially through the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. I was reminded by one of our current graduate students in my department this year that she is warmly regarded as one of not only the most practiced and most esteemed, but one of the most generous faculty members there. And I think from some of the commentary on her research that I'd like to share with you, just to give you a bit of a sense of her background and her work, you might come to understand why. As I understand it, she received her BA from Novosibirsk State University some time ago. Her MPhil and her PhD in social and political theory followed from Cambridge. Many of us got to know Alena's work from her first book, which is the widely read and much appreciated book, Russia's Economy of Favours. Those of you who know this book, and so often it's the signature first project that starts to tell you what someone has in their system, is simply just an extraordinary range of breadth and depth on a classic kind of subject that lots of people want to know about. We might call it corruption, we might call it informality, we might call it informal governments, we might call it a parallel economy. People do call it lots of these things. People want the world to be a better place, a more kind place, a more fair place. So every journalist and politician weighs in on these things. But it's not that often that not only do scholars take a step back and withhold judgment for a second to first get a sense to actually understand these phenomena across time and space, but actually to do it with from scholarly terms, a very interdisciplinary purchase, so that we have wide ranges of readers, but also in crossover terms, so that civilians can read these things too, and we don't see that very often. That first book, which is sometimes people will simply call it the blot book for thinking about the spirit of Favours, had wonderful historical depth in thinking about the roots in Russian social organization, Slavic social organization, Krugovaya Poruka, all these other various antecedents and so forth with which these practices might be associated. It also had wonderful clarity of sociological analysis so that we knew exactly what we were talking about. It was very clear in political terms, but of course what stands out more than anything is just there was, at least to me, a wonderful human quality to this book, because at no point was the dimension of this being lost, and I don't mean simply in just first-person testimonials, but in understanding the kinds of logics for why people would want to be participating in, and often very much taking pride in their social systems and social networks, even if other people from outside those worlds might think of them in other terms. After that bravura first book, many of us were delighted to see a second, which followed about 10 years later. It was called How Russia Really Works, How Does Russia Really Work? Sorry. How Russia Really Works. Good, okay, good. I put a question mark after that. More on informal practices, really scaling up again to thinking about broader Russian society for people, again, who may not know the field as well, but entirely with the stamp of someone from the scholarly world as well. Now on this side of the Atlantic, after your second book, there's no habilitación or anything like that, thank goodness, in the United States, so many people rest, many people stop. But that was not entirely the case here. We got to get a third book that followed in short order after that, Can Russia Modernize? System of Power Networks and Informal Governance, again from Cambridge. Another terrific work. All of the more reason why someone might say, I'm a senior professor at a big institution in London, and maybe now I'm going to hang back a bit. But no, right? The completion of the third book coincided with two enormous undertakings. The first, and this would be more than enough reason, it won't be the subject today, but more than enough reason, is that Alena was the founder of UCL's Fringe Center, which is incredibly important for all of us here because it took an area studies center run through the School of Slavonic and East European Studies and really tried to think about it in, to me at least, incredibly unusual ways. If some of you are interested in the cultivation of area studies and have never looked at their site, I really recommend it. You can subscribe to their newsletter. The basic idea is to try and think of this play between peripheries and centers in area studies, not so much in geographic terms, but in thematic terms, because so many topics get called up over and over and over again. So instead, for Fringe, and I had to write this one down, Fringe stands for fluidity, resistance, the invisible, the neutral, gray zones, and elusiveness. It's incredibly intellectually robust. I don't know where the cash comes from because it makes it sound like they have lots of cash, but I suspect that they don't, and they're just really good at creating an online presence. On the other hand, there is yet another reason why this kind colleague to the next of me has not been resting, and that's at the same time as she was founding this center, she was in full throttle with something called the Global Informality Project, which took so much of the work that was being done in Russia and really scaled it widely across now time and space to do the kind of comparative project and modeling that used to be common in social science, I would say, and really kind of fell off by the wayside. And where we still have these, and for anyone who has not had the chance yet to see the first of the 2 volumes, which are up here at the front of the room, but also incredibly uncommonly free to download in PDF form, they're incredibly unusual volumes because on the one hand, with great comparative rigor and systematic modeling, they want to look at informal practices across the globe, every part of the globe, but at the same time, not one of these books sacrifices still the kind of the really fine-grained analysis that keeps it human and compelling to read. In that spirit, last but not least, that is why we invited her here to reflect on this project and anything else about which she might like to share. The title for today is Russia More Informal Than Other Countries? Evidence from the Global Informality Project. So please join me in welcoming our guest today, Alena Ledeneva.
Well, thank you very much. Bruce, I don't know if you want to pass it over.
Sure.
So that at least people could feel the weight.
This one here, and start one in the back.
And the funny thing about this one is that they prepared this special travel edition for me, which is twice as slim as a normal book, so I could carry it with me to show people and also to present the new series and actually also the new press, because UCL Press is only 2 years old and they are the first pioneering press which profess open access, which is to say that everything they publish immediately is accessible to all people around the globe through PDF, but one could also order a printed edition which will be very, very cheap because they print on demand, and therefore even the book of that magnitude is still only £20. They are also offering us a discount of 20% if you'd like to order, and I put a few leaflets there with a discount if you're interested. Well, I would be very, very grateful if you could interrupt me with questions so that it grows into a conversation rather than me talking at you. So please give me a sign if you want to come in at any point. But I would like to speak maybe just half an hour to explain to you the ideas behind this project and how it came into being. So the project currently exists in 2 forms, one of which is the encyclopedia project that goes around, and it's really a book that I've organized as it's a global data set, and it's organized and structured by me in order to reveal the tensions that actually exist in informality studies, but also are central to the workings of human societies around the globe. In effect, if you ask me to define in one word what you have in those two volumes, you have an informal view of the world. And the introduction in the book is actually called an informal view of the world. The idea has been very, very simple. When we look at various societies in academic terms, very often what we do, we are projecting the existing categories and concepts on what we see. In this project, I thought it would be very interesting to see what's happening without that prism that we normally use to analyze informality, without stigmatization, without conceptual framing, but use the language of participants to what they think they do or what they say they do. This way, the project came out to be quite influenced by Wittgenstein's concepts of first language games, something that people capture in their daily exchanges in idiomatic language associated with informality is exactly what captures the participant's perspective on things. Secondly, when I looked at the wealth of the language games that we've assembled through the open call and through networking, through Google Scholar search for entries, we tried to cluster the existing language games by Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance, which is to say, we find practices that look like they belong to the same family. They might have different eyes, noses, or ears, but fundamentally you could see the proximity. And when I organized, and for me, the most difficult part of this project was to actually organize table of content that you could find in both volumes, because what I try to do is to create that kind of proximity of entries to each other, so that the two neighboring entries would be something very, very similar. But in every chapter, when you scale from one to another, you see the kind of difference emerging. And of course, each entry comes from everywhere, so this project is not structured geographically. They are just really practices emerging from all over the place in different area studies, as it were, and they've written by different scholars from different disciplines. But because they are put together and clustered on the basis of family resemblance, what you see, you could actually compare different practices and see the universal pattern underneath them without losing the specificity of the context. And this actually creates a very interesting sort of methodological device where you could compare the incomparable without losing the contextuality of informal practices, however also observing the pattern of informality that is hiding behind each cluster. So that was a kind of meta-analysis of the database that was undertaken by me. But in order to assemble this database, we've of course had to work as a network of researchers, which in the book, actually the published work is by 223 researchers coming from 5 continents, 66 countries are covered one way or another, and possibly much more, because some practices, for example, are spread in sub-Saharan Africa. So it would be a few countries rather than one. But we've also created an online version of the project. I've actually tried to upload the website as well to show you how it looks at the moment. So the online version has got the main page and the main findings, for example, that give you a very brief analysis of what's actually in the book in general terms. And those findings, I think, just 9, inclusive of various aspects of informality. There are also, you could download volumes and see, for example, what happened, on Friday in Zurich and yesterday in Washington in terms of the events that are associated with the project. But you also have ideas of theoretical framing of the data set, and that's how, for example, you could see how the clusters of practices and the patterns of informality have been associated with ideas about redistribution, solidarity, market, and domination, each of which actually has got a Yanis-faced structure, the ambivalent structure within each part. And each chapter, and that also actually happens to be quite Wittgensteinian in his paradigmatic example of rule following, when he says that you could continue the sequence 2, 4, 8, 16 without knowing the formula. So what we do in the project, we've got one project, 2 volumes, 4 types of ambivalence, 8 chapters to illustrate each type of ambivalence, and 16 theoretical framings. So we invited, after we've got the database, we invited academics to actually try to conceptualize and tell us what they've seen in each cluster. That was quite an interesting exercise in itself. For example, you could see different perspectives on the findings of the Global Informality Project, meaning to say that you, for example, have people in management study who look at how you could manage economies of favors, or you have anthropological views on interested and disinterested giving, or you could look at the ideas behind networks and how networks create a lock-in effect for those people who belong to them. You've got ideas about functional ambivalence and the sliding slope from need to greed type of strategies. You also have a very interesting ideas about how power operates and relies on informal leverage and informal mechanisms and informal governance in the case of the regimes. So those kind of theoretical framings are, they belong to people who have created those analyses, and also to the general frame, which is represented by encyclopedia. But here in the project, you could actually get all entries and create your own structure from scratch. You could actually try to find the patterns that you see. You could do a search by the country, by region, by keyword, and it actually also is doable with the PDF that you could download in open access, and try to pull out whatever your interest is. And the wealth of material is actually quite overwhelming. At least it was certainly for me, because even with countries which are represented already online, but the database is growing. Almost every day we are receiving something else, and at the moment I think it's 72 countries already that are captured in this data set. We also have a lot of interest in terms of downloading the project. Before I came here, I got the latest numbers from the University College Press, and they are telling me that the downloads have already been taking place in 146 countries around the globe, and there are, in the end, in September, it was 33,000 downloads, and it's probably much more now. So there is this kind of interest and enthusiasm that exists around the project, and I wonder if we ever be able to actually cover the global informality map of the world evenly and represent each country there is. If you could see what is depicted here, you could see that Russia is covered much more than other countries by the informal practices that one finds there. And hence the question mark in the title of today's talk: is Russia more informal than others? And this question for me has got quite a few interesting implications. First of all, of course, I am a scholar of Russia, and that made my networks and knowledge and expertise really centered in Russia, which is why maybe in the book that you've just seen, Russia is represented by 18 practices, and some countries are represented maybe by 5 or 2, and some countries are represented by 1. So it's very uneven for now, and we are just growing as a snowballing, in the snowballing kind of technique. But because I was leading a huge 5-year-long, largest ever funded by the European Commission social sciences research project on anti-corruption, I was particularly interested in countries which regularly come to the top of anti-corruption index, such as Finland, Denmark, New Zealand, countries which are supposed to be clean. And I was really curious whether informality does not exist there, because we seem to associate informality with Russia, where everything is non-transparent and murky, but whether informality exists actually outside post-socialist world was a big question. And of course, when I reached out to other area studies scholars, what I figured immediately, that outside our field, which was socialism, post-socialism, we find development studies and urban planning. People who understand informality very differently. For them, informality is 100% visible in the form of shanty towns, slums, favelas, and various forms of informal settlements, which are considered informal because they are lacking at least 3 fundamental formal infrastructural bits, such as, for example, water, sanitation and electricity, or electricity, waste and waste collection and something else. So basically the definition of informality in urban planning, that you have to be missing at least 3 basic suppliers of services. Now, when we started talking across discipline and area, they didn't realize that informality for us meant all those invisible hidden practices, unwritten rules, open secrets that exist in our field. So that was immediately a very interesting sort of conjunction of perspectives. Further on, I reached out to people who actually knew about anti-corruption champions, and I specifically looked into how informality works in Switzerland, for example, where they pride themselves into the informal rule being to follow formal rule. And they kind of are so universalists in terms of rule following that we thought we'll never find any informality there. However, what's interesting is that whether you go to Scandinavia or Switzerland or Germany or any country that you would think is universalist, you find very interesting ways in which informality works, and not only it works, it's constituent to the workings of formal institutions. And there we found, for example, in Finland, a network of Dear Brothers, which is based in military service that people undertake when they're young for 3 months. But then what happens is that they reassemble every year with the same group, and that actually is very essential element of what they now call structural corruption in Finland, which has nothing to do with bribery, has nothing to do with patronal politics or any kind of forms that we are familiar with, but it's absolutely the phenomenon that is known in the UK under the idiom of old boy network, where you go to private school and you grow up together with people with whom you have a bond and a tie that is not tangible, and yet it's absolutely definitive whenever life chances come your way. And the fact that those type of instruments are very widespread in anti-corrupt countries was very interesting. Moreover, what we find, for example, in Switzerland, that the networks of little cousins, as they call them in German-speaking part of Switzerland, and associated with solidarities created within the small localities and alpine villages, they are really instrumental for understanding the consensual model of democracy in Switzerland and really become part of the workings of democracies. If we go to Denmark, they've got this fascinating phenomenon of janteloven, which is a kind of krugovая порука type of thing based on mutual vigilance that is supposed to suppress meritocracy. So you're not supposed to be sticking out and doing well and get excellent marks. So much so that people at school actually will give you an average mark whichever performance you present. That creates national psyche in which sticking out is no good. And the interesting thing, of course, is Denmark is also right on the top of the index of best for entrepreneurship, best business environment, and it's certainly an ambivalence that you could see there, because on the one hand they are absolutely sort of egalitarian, on the other hand they're very competitive, and those things really have not been looked into at all. And when I started digging in that direction, a lot of very interesting open secrets about societies come up. So, in other words, a lot of things and assumptions that we have about informality have come into question once you look at it through cross-area and cross-discipline. Association of informality with poverty and underdevelopment that used to be coming from Latin America and the study of development studies and the idea of informal settlements and association with underdevelopment. Association with socialism, for example, and oppressive regimes, also that comes from our field, but very much questioned within that global setting. Association with informality being a bad thing, being a stigma for society, being associated with corruption, is also something that actually becomes questionable once you look at it in more detail. So theoretically, therefore, this data set is sort of put a lot of question marks, which are there for everyone to see and to explore further, because obviously for one person, for me in particular, it was a little bit too overwhelming to actually assemble the database, create a website, an online version for everyone to work with, but also try to analyze it at the same time and try to publish the book and get it out very quickly. But I was hoping, just as we created that network expertise around the globe on informal practices in various corners, it was also quite interesting for me to see that we could actually create networks in theoretical analysis of what we are finding here. And I'm very pleased to say that already on the website we put together some calls for special issues on informality that emerges in different disciplines from authors who actually found each other through this project. So maybe I'll say a few words about Russia and the idea of interdisciplinarity and how that played in covering Russia. Because what you immediately see here is, because we used, when we originally started on the Google map of informality, it automatically puts contemporary entries of Russian Federation somewhere in Siberia, where I come from Novosibirsk Academy town, and it puts historical entries back to Moscow and the former USSR. You could also see that we really managed to assemble very interesting range of subjects, not only, historically, but for example, Jeffrey Hoskin, who is this famous historian of the Soviet Union, who worked at my school of Slavonic and East European Studies, when he looked at Krugovaya Poruka, for example, I asked him to see if there was something like this in Europe, for example, maybe earlier on, or how it could be seen in a wider context in terms of area studies. And he produced a fascinating analysis for the book on Krugovaya Poruka across Europe. And that also was quite counterintuitive for him, that actually, as a mechanism of informal practices, this collective responsibility, or collective irresponsibility, we could say, was actually instrumental to majority of European countries in the past. We also found very interesting practices associated with the cultural production and cultural consumption, where social anthropologists and cultural anthropologists helped a lot. I noticed you've got Tamizdat here, so we've got Samizdat, we've got Magnitizdat, we've got Rentgenizdat, all kind of very interesting sets of practices associated with music or text that was associated with oppressive regimes and the non-conformist behavior and consumerism under the Soviet system. So in my personal view, I thought, you know, when we talk about socialisms or communism, it is essential to produce some kind of cultural crossover or comparative perspective. When I studied blood, the use of personal networks for getting things done in the Soviet Union, what I first received in view of the critique to the book was very helpfully the colleagues pointed out that my book is ahistorical, doesn't cover any regional dimensions, and it's not comparative. So ever since I was charged to try and be more interested in history and comparison and try to produce regional variation within the Soviet Union, so to make my analysis more sophisticated. And as part of this endeavor, I worked with Mayfair Young, who has written a book on art of social relationships and banquets and gift giving in China. So we did an article which is comparative to on blood and guanxi, which is a Chinese version of blood, we could say. Apart from the fact that, very interestingly, guanxi comes and originates in Confucianism and has got a very sort of philosophical, deep religious type of background or origins, whereas blood as a term and also as a kind of perception among people comes from the criminal underworld, which is entirely the opposite of how it is in China. So we kind of realized that things that might look very similar in terms of daily operations could have an entirely different type of origins, and could therefore be considered as faux amis, how to say, the false friends of a translator, where you could see, for example, in the encyclopedia, the chapter 1, and economies of favors, and we found all the language games that actually associated with alternative currencies that exist in social exchanges, informal exchanges. However, those exchanges could be very, very different indeed, which is why I thought the value of putting them together in their own context is actually in the fact that we do not do comparative analysis like, for example, those people who try to analyze social capital in comparative perspective. When they take a concept and just look at it, you know, across the country without sophistication of understanding what it might be like in northern Italy or South Italy. So in this project, we try to minimize that risk, but by actually retaining the qualitative analysis and contextualization within the text. So each entry is presented online as a wiki. So it's basically an informality wiki, and it has a fairly short description, and you've seen already how it looks on the database. Actually, the shortness of the entries, here I must say, my daughter said, "Mom, you finally have produced a perfect toilet book," because you could actually put encyclopedia, it looks quite beautiful, in your bathroom and read just one entry at a time. And each entry gives you this kind of zoom in, some fascinating practice that you might never even heard about, with sufficient detail and examples, and sometimes media coverage, sometimes an interesting story, a research finding, and a further reading if you want to. But at the same time, it's quite punchy and it's easy to read, and it's entertaining. But it also gives you a chance to see them as a cluster, and then you go deeper into analysis. So the idea is behind this collection is really to capture open secrets, which are secrets to outsiders. Because if you are arriving somewhere, you might not realize that some kind of honbao or okurima no no shukan exist. However, if you are insider, you are so in the practice that you might not necessarily be able to articulate it. So the subject matter of open secrets, in a way, it disappears between that kind of insider-outsider perspective. So the encyclopedia is really trying to pin down things which all insiders know but do not speak about, and all outsiders have no way of knowing. So it's that kind of a crossover of two perspectives that is essential angle and an entry point for the project. The main difficulty, though, with this data set is when you look at those informal practices, what you see very clearly is that they are the practices that work. They're really what works in a society. However, they present both a problem-solving technique and an issue and a problem at the same time, depending on who you are asking. Because the most visible part of informality, say informal settlements, informal dwelling for people, is, of course, it presents a solution for those people who could not afford a better type of housing. But of course, in a societal level, it's a huge problem. What do you do with those informal, illegal dwellings that have no infrastructure, and it's too late to actually to connect them to the communications? So you have that intrinsic ambivalence about informality, where it is both a solution and a problem. And in order to think about it in terms of policy thinking or policy making analysis, you have to see how you could improve on the supportive part of informality while reducing the subversive part of informality, and how you could actually create policies that would tackle the ambivalence. And that's what I think makes this work quite instrumental for future analysis and for policy making, because we are looking at all forms of informality that could be understood by way of shortcut as double think, double deed, double standard, and double incentive. And that sort of range of practices is something that is essential for understanding informality as a phenomenon, but also to see what we could do with it in terms of policy implications. What I would like to show you very briefly is maybe in terms of methodology, I should say that my take on informality in Russia has been bottom-up, and this is a kind of perspective that I try to keep in my view on this global project, In the Russia's economy of favors, I looked at the workings of the grassroots level, and then in the 1990s transition of Russia, I looked at the professional, business and political networks. And in the final book, it's about the way how power networks are used as a governance instrument by the Kremlin's insiders. So you basically have 3 periods and also 3 levels of entry on informal networks that shows how those networks operated. I tried to look at it comparatively in more depth in China, and also look at economies of favors in a wider range of disciplines, with David Hoenig and Nicolette Makovicki actually have published the whole volume on economies of favor in Central and Eastern Europe, with concrete studies as to how it worked, and their cases include Mongolia and countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Hungary, and it's a fascinating analysis. But then, of course, it's quite interesting to see how that type of approach could be spread over to other forms of informality, not just alternative currencies and exchanges. And what we discovered in the global data set, that a lot of recent developments and complexities in the world result, for example, in cyberinformality emerging. So we see quite a lot of evidence on alternative currencies, cryptocurrencies, cyber attacks, blockchain-based practices, and that is arguably could be called informal in the sense that it's not sufficiently regulated yet in the cyberspace, but also with the fact that they use the network-based mechanisms that informal practices based on. So just to maybe conclude, I would like to say that I'm very proud of all people who have contributed to the project, because we actually managed to create this network expertise of many scholars, which now met each other and work independently on the following volumes in the Fringe series. For example, we are going to have a volume on informal housing around the globe, again trying to counterpose, countries which are poor and underdeveloped, countries which are European, but also Wall Street Occupy movements, which represent a very sort of politicized way of squatting. That is the point in question. We've also identified a lot of interesting patterns that are just expecting for further generations of researchers, and that's been quite fascinating. At the moment, it looks like the 3rd volume that is currently being shaped up moves in the direction of impossibility to categorize clearly in very basic distinctions such as age, gender, race, religion, and all those practices which actually account for accommodating the complexity and growing complexity of the contemporary world. So we've got quite a lot of interesting material coming that way. So maybe just to conclude with ambivalence and tease you a little bit in case you want to ask me, but I'm not going to talk about it, is actually the 4 types of ambivalence that I've identified following upon the work of Zygmunt Bauman on identity, on modernity and ambivalence. He actually defines ambivalence as impossibility of assigning an object or event to one category. And we've looked into the issues of substantive ambivalence that are represented here by sociability instrumentality, which is intrinsic to the relationship, which is considered to be sociable, such as friendship, for example, but that could be put in the instrumental mode when needed. And in fact, what we've assembled as informal practice here really illustrate that point of impossibility to separate sociability and instrumentality. We also identified normative ambivalence, which has got the idea of double standards for us and for them behind it. And here, when we look at, for example, forms of solidarity, what we see very closely that the sense of belonging is actually at the same time has a function of exclusion of the others, and you certainly have that kind of lock-in effect if you belong to a network, and it might actually create a lock-in effect on you and make you a hostage, which has got a fascinating evidence from all over the world, and in especially in the diaspora and migration type of studies. The next type of ambivalence is a functional ambivalence, where I argue with an example of blood, for example, which many people consider to be detrimental to the Soviet system and corrosive and really undermining of the socialist doctrine by the way in which it served consumerism and really was anti-Soviet in nature. However, my point has always been that without blood, without Tolkachi, the Soviet system wouldn't have survived at all. So blood has actually played not only a subversive role, but also a supportive role by that very functioning. And that is really just one example of a lot of informal practices that seem to be serving human needs. But by doing so, they also support systems within which those needs are exercised. I also look at the way in which needs are associated with the grid, and how you could really be serving yourself by legitimizing it through the system made me do it type of argument, which kind of has a sliding slope all the way to really gaming the system for all kind of greed-driven, egoistic type of consideration. And the final type of ambivalence, which is associated with the mode of domination and power, is idea where you create, you co-opt the client and the pattern of recruiting clients and serving patrons is very essential for understanding the informal governance in the mode of domination. But the co-optation through redistribution of resources is really not nearly enough and has to be coupled with control, which could also be associated with instruments of informal governance and informal control. So we find a lot of evidence as to how informal governance is operational, both bottom-up, but also used by the oppressive systems in order to reproduce the type of domination that exists. So this motivational ambivalence is basically about the fact that when you identify informal practices, what they very often do, they cross over from the public to private in a way that is very hard to capture. Just as in the Soviet system, they used to claim that everything was taking place for the interest of the people and for the public interest, but while doing that, private pockets were filled and private needs were served and personal careers were made. And that kind of ambivalence in terms of motivation really is also one of those tensions that are expressed and embedded in informality and informal practices. So, well, basically that's our take on social and cultural complexity as captured in this project, which you know is probably a mouthful, but I hope you'd find some time to have a look at it and play with online resource and maybe find your own angle or your own entry into the data set. Thank you.
We have some easy time for questions for anyone who wants to jump into a big pool that's been presented to us. I can't resist just asking is the idea then, only because you posed a question in the title of this, is the idea then, as I understand you're saying, that Russia is not necessarily more informal than other places, but that it's been richly studied because people are so self-conscious of it following. I mean, I'm just guessing that precisely because of a historical break, you have this very uncommon situation where millions of people are incredibly self-conscious about things that most people don't reflect on in their own countries just because they've, relatively speaking, quite as much. So is it the case that you're dignifying Russia by saying, really, the whole world does this in different ways, but Russia's really a rich ground for thinking about it currently? Or is there actually a sense saying, you know, really the last 2 centuries really have shown that this is something where informal practice has self-consciously been risen to a higher art than in other places, comparatively speaking? Those are 2 different things to me.
Well, this question actually is...
I know it's the most obvious one of the talk, but I can't help it.
Well, it's actually a conclusion to the second volume. And we've written it together with Svetlana Barsukova, who is the School of Informality at the High School of Economics. And we worked with the Russian material because it's most represented in the collection. And what we're trying to say that although we've got 18 practices in the volume vis-a-vis much smaller sample in the other countries, it's really impossible to say you know, which country is more informal than another, because every country is informal in its own way. And that's what we try to put forward as an argument. Also, if you look at it from the cross-disciplinary perspective and look, for example, at behavioral economics and their experiments in their countries, say, for example, in the corruption field, what they discovered that there are no more corrupt cultures than others. You know, humans are universally susceptible to the constraints which define their behavior. And once you move the constraints, or you set up constraints in experimental way, for example, what you find then very interestingly is that those countries which are cultures which are universalist and are reactive to the rules, once you set up experimental rules for people to be corrupt, they become more corrupt than people who have double standards, as it were, and also are guided by informal norms. So in a way, Russia's propensity for double standards, for understanding the complications around the formal frameworks, and the idea that it's not necessarily that you always have to follow the letter of the law, because legality does not necessarily mean justice in the Russian universe. That makes them less susceptible to experimental conditions, for example. And it's quite interesting finding, which I think, to me, has got a very interesting implication that I would like to explore further on, which is to see, for example, that when Russians deal with complexity, and they deal on it in a lot of context associated with survival, traumatic history, complex political regimes, all those double things, double deeds, double standards, double motives, and they somehow find a way to be self-sufficient and survive in that circumstances, whether it has any know-how for us in terms of resilience capacity vis-a-vis the collapsing structures that we witness all over the world, with digitalization, for example. And it's the kind of ways in which you have a know-how to tackle complexity that really interests me, vis-a-vis policy implications. And we've already thinking, maybe creating some simulation games for complexity where you introduce context sensitivity to people who deal with policy making and public officials who work, for example, in environments which are different from their own. So, there are a lot of implications that come from that question. But I think originally whether Russia is more informal than others was really a personal response, because I live in London, and I don't know if you follow here, but it's almost impossible now to be in the UK without being constantly exposed to Russia bashing. I'm sure it's the same for you here, right? Because Russia is on the news. This year we had 1 week, not even complete week, but there was 1 week when there was a Brexit agreement that came out, and Russia fell out of the news for 5 days. And I felt like, oh, isn't it nice? Russia is not on the news. It's amazing. A little bit of rest, a little bit of relaxation, and guess what? After that, there is an Azov conflict. It's that very weekend when I just thought, okay, there might be, some sort of Russia-free time, and that kind of constant Russia bashing really feels, in personal terms, very difficult, because, I used to speak quite a lot for the media, for think tanks, and at the moment it's just becoming difficult, because I feel like I'm gonna wear a badge very soon saying I'm Russian with a little star here, because this kind of anti-Russian spirit is everywhere. It's even in academia. And that kind of question, is Russia really is abnormal, or is it more informal than others, really is driven by that kind of concern that, are we really that different? And that's why, I suppose I put it up for discussion here.
Thanks so much for your talk. Sorry, I don't know if I'm jumping in. So I very much admire your work, and I read How Russia Really Works as a grad student, and I teach it to students now. And one of the things that I really admire about that book is that, and it goes to your point about sort of, is Russia unique in some way? What I admire about the book is that it demonstrates how informal practices sometimes emerge out of circumstance, out of historical elements, out of necessity. And so it's nice for undergraduates to read, because it rebuts this idea that it's just culture. Like, there's something about Russian culture that makes Russians informal and prone to corruption and this sort of thing. And especially like we read it last spring, where kompromat made it into American political discussions, and lots of people heard the word, but they didn't understand what it was, and so it was great to read the origins. So I want to ask, when you're compiling these examples from around the world, because it struck me as you were speaking from examples from around the world, that you were getting actually closer to what I would say is a cultural explanation. So how close, I guess my question is, how did you define informal practices when you were collecting this data set? And is there a danger of moving backwards to this explanation that it's just culture? So for instance, the example you gave of Denmark, of this old boys network in Denmark. So is that just a cultural quirk of Denmark? So is there any danger of moving informal practices into the field of just cultural explanations? With something that's, where your objective is to make it relevant and comparative across the world, but there's this knee-jerk of just saying, well, then everything's just about culture.
Well, thank you for the question and for the feedback. It's first of all, in terms of definition, I had come up with this heuristic criteria for selecting material, which is really Wittgensteinian idea of a language game. So whenever there is a name of the practice that is used by people who practice it, that's good enough for me, because if people share a set of meanings, they understand what stands behind that word, like blood or kompromat. That's good enough for me. That makes it a practice. So in a way, that's my cutoff point, which also prevents conceptual entries to become part of the data set. We have conceptual entries, but they are in theoretical framing. But the data set is really built upon the language of participants. Why I think it's not really going back to the culture-based ideas is because what you see, for example, from the clustering those entries is those universal patterns that all those context-specific practices share. And that universal pattern has everything to do with humanity and nothing to do with individual cultures. And that's exactly the kind of patterns of informality that I'm keen on. And creating that context-sensitive comparisons help me to identify patterns of informality, which essentially I've also tried to show, and that you could see in the table of contents, that although I put in brackets where that idiom or language game came from, I do not limit, and very often entries have got cross references in the project. So you see, for example, if it is blood in Russia, it could be called something else elsewhere. So it's not really culturally specific to Russia, but it's a kind of pattern that could be found elsewhere. And I think it's also essential that I don't put informality in Americas, informality in Asia, informality in Europe. You know how normally, for example, if you take an international handbook on informal governance that was put together by Professor Christiansen and Professor Newholt, they've done it by world regions, which I think is just exactly would take it back to the kind of cultural specifics. But what I do, I cluster according to the family resemblance of practices and those kind of patterns of informality, and that makes it cross-cultural. I don't know if I...
Yeah, no, that's perfect, thank you.
Please, it's you too.
Thank you. You usually consider national informal practices, but what about international double standards or informal practices, like in a diplomatic area, in a scientific area, or maybe phenomena like polite green man, when it's like an export of informal practices? Is it developed?
Well, that's hugely important and very, very interesting. However, I would, I think the green man is already good enough to represent a practice, right, of unidentified military presence. And that certainly could become an entry. No one has submitted it yet, but I suppose it will have to pass the test of time a little bit, but maybe if that lives, you know, the green man, or if there is an interest or someone does research on that, we would certainly be very happy, because we've got an open door policy and self-nominated system of deadlines. Like everyone could submit almost any research that they've done. Our idea is that it is research-based, so you do have preferably a pioneering research on something that has not been identified before. And we do have, for example, you know, I have a class on informal practices that I teach, and we work on projects with students. For example, they work on practices such as ghostwriting, which, you know, seem to be generally acknowledged. However, very peculiar status covered by the confidentiality agreements and totally legal, contracted. A publishing sector is very dependent on it. At the same time, it produces very interesting set of cases. For example, you know, in medical journals where ghostwriting has got a very sort of peculiar function. So in diplomatic communities, you know, double standards certainly they would exist, but again, I would be keen to see what kind of language the diplomatic community uses for what they do when they're exercising them. Because what I'm trying to stay clear of is to imposing certain conceptual frames upon material. So we are trying to work bottom up and use participants' language. So that's basically the difference that we are making in comparison to all other academic projects that you come across.
So in response to this, the privileging the international would in some ways reinforce the national, you're saying. Is that part of it? Because that was part of your question, wasn't it? These international level players that don't fit into these other...
Yeah.
Well, we've got a tag which is called general. So, for example, you know, insider trading, that would actually cross the borders effectively. We've got blockchain, we've got bitcoins. I mean, they're all practices that are actually, you know, supranational in level. But again, I'm working with categories that sort of pin it down rather than trying to elevate to a certain level myself.
No, but it's also a steady refusal of the categories people expect to see.
Mm.
Few questions. What do you find in terms of historical trends when you have major political changes like the collapse of the Soviet system, in terms of practices, the informal practices? Do they tend to change a good bit or pretty much stay the same? Another question is, with increasing globalization and multinational corporations, does that have any impact on the practices? Those corporations tend to incorporate local practices, or do they themselves influence local practices by their... And looking into the future, we have increasing big data and algorithms and artificial intelligence. What kind of influence might that have in terms of how those algorithms are structured and changing informal practice to something more mechanical?
Oof. Thank you. Well, in terms of big transformations and social changes, what I've done in my work on Russia, which I know best, I looked how blood was a know-how of the Soviet system, being based on the pillars of the Soviet system, which is planned economy, centralized distribution of privileges, and non-monetary type of mentality, where people could exchange in the long term without thinking of quick returns, as it were. And then when the Soviet Union has collapsed, it was my research project to find out what happened to blood, because all the pillars on which it rested have gone. And it was interesting because there was no good answer to that one, because when I tried to argue that blood has actually came down together with the system, people would say, no, but we're still using it. And then if you say, well, blood has actually preserved its importance, people would say, oh no, but it's entirely different now because it's monetarized, because it's not enough to have just blood. You have to have an entry by blood, but then you still have to pay a bribe or whatever. It comes with this monetarized economy. And then I also become interested in, okay, if blood has reduced its meaning or transformed or monetarized, which practices become the new know-how of the transition? And in this book, which was already mentioned, How Russia Really Works, I looked into which practices emerge to facilitate post-Soviet reforms. And there you find, for example, practices of democratic elections emerging first time, competitive elections. So what you see emerging in conjunction to that is practice of black public relations, black PR, and polittechnology, which actually comes in order to facilitate competitiveness of the elections, but at the same time starts undermining the culture of competitive elections, because what they do instead, they use compromising materials and all kind of dirt tricks and political technology that plays on splitting the electorate in order to undermine people's belief in the elections and making them really just another fake as it was. The same thing happens in the legal reforms and the equality in the face of the law that was introduced in the post-Soviet period. And also in the economic sphere, where you introduce the kind of freedom of the market, but at the same time there is a sum of practices associated with financial scheming that actually plays against the system, which is now a market, just the same way it played the plant system. So you have that sort of dynamics, and practices certainly emerge in order to respond to the new formal constraints that emerge and grow. And we now see, for example, in the Balkans, I'm part of the Horizon 2020 European Commission project in the Balkans on closing the gap between formal and informal institutions, because what is happening in the region, they try to become part of the European Union, so they Europeanize. And that way they try to synchronize legislation and the legal framework in order to satisfy the Copenhagen criteria. And of course what they do, they pass thousands of pages of legislation through national parliaments in order to synchronize. But what you see instead, that in reality nothing much changes. So you have that gap between formal constraints and reality actually widening as an outcome of this transition that's supposed to bring it down. So the big question, of course, is what do you do to actually close the gap between the two, and how to create the implementation of legislation that is very alien in terms of the local norms and local knowledge. I think that would be a very similar type of dynamics with multinationals, because when they arrive, they face exactly the same tension between headquarter mentality and anti-corruption policies and everything that they are supposed to be compliant with in terms of international norms, and the local knowledge that might dictate a very different set of behaviors. And here again, closing the gap between the two is actually a very interesting gray area, where a lot of things depend on a particular leadership of a particular joint venture or multinational boss who actually finds instruments. And so we've done quite a bit of training actually at INSEAD Business School for global leaders and chairman of the company boards that actually profess the international norms and try to sort of distribute good practices downwards to see how they could integrate context and how to include context sensitivity to the ways in which it's done. So, but that's work in progress. We are sort of designing a simulation games that would address those kind of issues.
We always try to hold the time, but if there's one last question, we perhaps anyone and then.
So we just touched upon a really interesting subject, I think, a subject that is discussed in the literature about the evolution of interplay of informal and formal institutions, right? So there's now a stream in the literature that actually thinks that the more formal institutions develop and strengthen, right, the less is the influence of informal institutions. So some scholars would say actually Guangxi will disappear in the next 5 or 10 years, right? And well, also based on my own experience, when you write papers about blood, for example, you hardly get this published anymore. I received reviewer comments that were saying there's no blood anymore. In Russia, you only have Swazi these days, right? So what do you think about this? Is this actually a matter for the strength of informal institutions? Is this a matter of the strength of formal institutions? And a little bit provocative, do we really need to care about informal practices if they maybe disappear so or so in the long run, if institutions strengthen?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think here you would really have your answer varying depending on which discipline you're in. Like the way you pose the question sounds to me like sort of political science type of influence, where Helmke-Levitsky type of typology, and how we tend to think about formalization as being a good thing, or formalization being a panacea. From where I come from, in terms of my research and the perspective bottom up, what I see is that formalization creates more problem than it solves. Claims for an anti-corruption field, for example, that I probably know best, zero tolerance policies, transparency, accountability, disclosure type of discourse is so expensive, it's unbearable. Information laws, all kind of bureaucracies that emerges from formalization. It really creates more issues than it resolves. What it does, it might push informality in a darker corner, but it doesn't really address the balance between formal and informal in the way in which it exists in real world. You could not get rid of informality just because you could not get rid of culture and you could not get rid of human nature. And human nature is complex. It's like yin and yang, you know, in Eastern type of paradigm. And I think, I wish, I suppose, political scientists, when they think about their typologies of informal institutions, they come from sort of idea of balance and put formal and informal on equal footing, rather than giving priority and centrality to formal institutions and seeing everything else as residual. But that's, you know, disciplinary bias that I have.
I know there was one more question floating, but we are a little over time, so I mainly want to, for now, just thank our speaker again for coming all of this way, and we hope she'll come more often.